All right, let's dive right into this deep dive. I know you're already pretty familiar with React, but testing it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things that can be tough to get a good handle on.
Exactly, and you want to really master it and master it quickly.
Absolute.
So to help you out, we've got a ton of resources here,
Yeah, we do.
like blog posts, official documentation, even some training material.
Yep, all curated to help you level up your testing game.
Exactly.
Ooh.
So we're going to try to sift through all of this and
Yeah, find the gems.
yeah, extract the really, really practical stuff, the tips, the common pitfalls.
Right, we want to make you a better developer, not just teach you how to write tests that pass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where do we even begin with all of this stuff? It feels like a mountain of information.
You know, even really experienced developers can miss the forest for the trees sometimes. We really need to start with the big picture stuff, the core philosophy of the testing library.
Okay.
This isn't about just, checking boxes and making sure your tests pass. It's about building better software.
All right, so what's the big idea? What's the main idea here?
Well, the testing library, it really emphasizes testing your app the way users actually experience it.
Yeah.
They say it really well in the docs. The more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how do we actually translate that idea into the way we write tests?
Well, it all starts with how you query for elements in your tests.
Right.
We're trying to think like a user, right? So instead of going for all the internal implementation details,
Right.
we prioritize querying by role by text.
Yeah.
Those attributes that users are actually going to perceive.
Right, so get by role instead of digging into the DOM and using a test ID.
Exactly. Let's say you have a button that submits a form.
Right.
You'd use get by role button with the name submit.
Mm-hmm.
And that targets the button based on how it works and what the user sees.
Right.
So not only does that make your test more robust, but it actually helps to make sure your app is accessible to everybody,
Yeah.
even folks who are using screen readers.
Okay, so I see how that ties back to accessibility.
Yeah.
But what about those cases where using get by role just doesn't work or feels kind of awkward?
Yeah, get by role isn't always a perfect fit. Sometimes you might need to use something like get by text or, in some cases, even get by test ID.
Right.
The key is to always think about how a user would find and interact with that element.
Yeah.
What would they see? What would they click on?
Right. Okay, so we've got our querying strategy down. What's the next step in this whole testing journey?
Well, let's talk about the testing library ESLint plugins.
Okay.
They're like little helpers that can be absolute lifesavers, especially when you're first starting out.
Mm-hmm.
They catch common mistakes, they enforce best practices, to keep your code nice and clean.
Yeah, I have to admit I haven't really dug deep into those ESLint plugins. What kind of mistakes are they catching?
Well, they'll warn you if you're using the wrong queries or if you're accidentally testing implementation details.
Okay.
They'll even let you know if you're not following accessibility guidelines.
That's great.
And the best part, if you're using Create React app, it's already built in.
Oh, wow, less configuration.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, now before we move on, you mentioned get by test ID earlier, and I know there are some pretty strong opinions about test IDs.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hot topic, right?
Yeah.
Kent C. Dodds, he's the one who created the testing library.
Right.
He's got some really strong opinions about this. He argues that, they often lead to brittle tests that break easily when you change your UI.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely had that experience. Change one small thing and suddenly your tests are failing, even though everything looks fine on the screen.
Right. It's like a house of cards.
Yeah.
One little breeze and the whole thing collapses.
Yeah.
But to be fair, there are some valid arguments for using test IDs, especially when you're dealing with complex dynamic content.
Okay, so it's about striking a balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Avoid test IDs when we can, but sometimes they're necessary.
Yeah.
We also don't want to just randomly throw in accessibility attributes on everything.
Oh, no. That's a big no.
I remember that from the blog post. That was a big no-no.
You can actually make things worse if you do that.
Yeah.
If you're adding A or IA attributes without actually understanding what they do,
Right.
it's like speaking a language you don't understand.
Sure.
You might think you're communicating, but you're actually just creating confusion.
Okay, so those accessibility attributes, they're powerful tools,
Right.
but we need to use them wisely and strategically.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered the whole philosophy. We talked about some querying strategies.
Yep.
What about actually writing these tests? I know you've got some code examples tucked away in those testing fundamentals notes.
Oh, yeah. Let's take a look at some examples.
Right.
We've got some basic jest setup. And then we can dive into some examples of testing components,
Okay.
hooks, and even some integration tests.
Perfect. I'm ready to get my hands dirty with some code.
Let's do it.
But first, let's make sure we have a good understanding of that Jest configuration. I always feel a little lost when I'm looking at those config files.
Yeah, I get that. It can be a bit daunting. But the good news is, Just comes with a pretty standard config that works well for most React apps.
Okay.
We'll look at the main parts.
All right.
And I'll point out a few areas where you might need to tweak things depending on your project.
Great. So let's crack open that config file and see what's inside.
Okay, let's do it. All right, so let's break down this Just config. You'll see right at the top the test environment is set to JSTM.
Okay.
And this is pretty standard for React apps because it simulates a browser environment
Right.
without actually needing to open a real browser.
Okay.
Keeps our tests nice and fast and lightweight.
Ah, so that's why our tests can run in the terminal without needing to open like a Chrome window or anything.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Makes things a lot smoother.
Clever.
And then we have setup files after ends. And this is where you'd put any kind of like global setup code that you need to run before your tests.
Right.
And one of the key ones for React testing is at testing library JSTM.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Is that the one that gives us those nice handy matchers like to be in the document?
That's the one.
Yeah, I really like those. I find them so much easier to read than having to write out all those like complex DOM checks manually.
Yeah, it just makes things so much more expressive, you know?
Yeah.
Instead of like, expect element dot text content dot to be something, you can just say expect element dot to have text content, something.
Right. Yeah, much more elegant.
Much more elegant, exactly.
Yeah, I like that. I like elegant code.
Keep it simple.
Is there anything else in this config that's like super crucial before we start looking at those code examples?
You'll probably see the typical stuff for code coverage if you want to track how much of your app is actually being tested.
Right.
And then maybe some module aliases depending on how your project's set up.
Right.
But the core stuff, the really important bits for most React projects
Yeah.
are going to be that JSTM environment and setting up those testing library utilities.
Got it. Okay, so foundation is solid.
So
Now on to the fun part.
yeah, let's write some tests.
Actually writing the tests. You've got those examples for testing components and hooks and integration tests, right?
Yep, exactly.
Where should we start?
Let's start with components.
Okay.
We've got this nice little button component, the classic example.
Yeah.
And we're testing things like, rendering with different props, handling clicks, and making sure it disables correctly.
Okay, so the good old button component. I feel like every coding tutorial starts with that, but
Yeah, it's a classic for a reason, right?
it's like so fundamental.
Yeah.
What kind of assertions are we actually making in these tests?
So for one, we want to make sure that the button actually shows the right text based on the props that we pass in. And then we're going to be simulating a click using user event,
Right.
which is, our preferred way of handling those events.
Yeah.
And then we verify that the button's on-click handler is actually called the way we expect it to.
I always get tripped up on when to use user event versus fire event. Is there like a simple rule of thumb?
Yeah, generally speaking, user event is going to be your go-to choice.
Mm.
It more closely resembles how a user interacts with the page. Think of it this way. Fire event is like poking at individual DOM events.
Right.
But user event is like having a user actually click or type or interact with your app.
Ah, okay. That's a much better way to think about
It's
it.
all about, treating your tests like actual user interactions.
Yeah.
Just like with our querying strategies.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It all ties together.
Yep. I like that. And with that button example, we're also testing to make sure that the button is disabled. Like if we pass in a certain prop, like is loading.
Right. Yeah, we want to make sure the UI behaves correctly based on the different states in our app.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered basic rendering, event handling, and like that conditional rendering with the button component. What about testing custom hooks? Those always seem a bit more complex to me.
Yeah, hooks can be a little tricky. But remember that React hooks testing library we talked about?
Right.
It's our secret weapon for this.
Yes, that's the one that lets us test hooks, like in isolation, without having to create those like dummy components just for testing.
Exactly. It makes things so much simpler. If the hook has a lot of logic or is meant to be reusable,
Right.
it makes sense to test it directly.
Yeah.
But if it's just like a tiny helper function that's really tightly coupled to a specific component, then you might be better off testing it indirectly just through that component's tests.
Right. So it's about picking the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
And I guess it also depends on your comfort level with actually testing hooks directly.
Yeah. And remember, the goal here is to write tests that give you confidence in your code. You don't want to make more work for yourself.
Right.
If testing through the component is easier and it gives you enough coverage,
Yeah.
then go for it.
Okay, so we've tackled component testing, dipped our toes into hook testing. What about integration tests? Where do those fit in?
Integration tests are all about making sure that different parts of your app work together smoothly,
Okay.
from the components to the hooks to the API calls.
Right. So instead of just looking at like a single unit of code,
Yeah,
we're looking at how all those units actually interact.
exactly. We might test like, a whole user flow,
Okay.
like adding something to a shopping cart, going through checkout, submitting an order.
Sounds pretty involved. How do we actually make sure those tests are reliable, especially when we're dealing with things like network requests or like external dependencies?
That's where mocking comes in.
Mocking.
We could use Jest's built-in mocking capabilities to simulate API responses or database interactions. Anything that's outside of our component's direct control.
Okay, hold on. Mocking always trips me up a little bit. Can you give me like a concrete example of how we'd use that in an integration test?
Sure. So let's say you have a component that fetches some data from an API when it loads.
Right.
In your integration test, you don't want to actually rely on that API being available.
Right, because it could be down, the network could be slow, all sorts of things could go wrong.
Right. It can make your tests really flaky.
Right.
So instead, you'd use jest.mock to intercept that API call
Okay.
and return a predefined response. So that way your test is focused on just how the component handles that data,
Okay.
not the actual network conditions.
Right, I see.
So it gives you more control over your testing environment.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So with mocking, it's like we're creating this little controlled world for our tests to run in.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're in control.
Yeah. But I have to admit, I still get a little lost in the syntax and the different ways to mock things in Jest. It's like a whole other language.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It can be a bit of a rabbit hole. But the Jest documentation is pretty good.
Okay.
And there's a ton of tutorials and blog posts out there that can help you wrap your head around it.
Okay, good. Good. I'll have to spend some time with those mocking resources.
For sure.
But before we dive too deep into mocking, I want to circle back to that ACT thing for a second.
Okay.
We talked about it earlier, but
Yeah.
I'm still a little fuzzy on why it's so important and when we actually need to use it.
Right. Yeah. It's all about making sure that your tests are running in a way that's consistent with how React updates actually happen in the browser. Okay, I get that in theory, but I'm more of a visual learner. Do you have an example of like a situation where ACT is absolutely essential?
Sure. Imagine you have a component that uses useState to manage some internal state.
Mm-hmm.
When a button is clicked,
Yeah.
the state updates, and then that triggers a re-render of the component.
Right.
If you're testing that behavior,
Yeah.
you need to wrap that button click and the assertions that come after it inside of ACT.
Okay, so ACT is basically saying to React like, hey, treat this whole block of code as a single unit of user interaction.
Exactly. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like making sure that all the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Without ACT, you might be testing individual pieces, but not how they actually connect as a whole.
I think that analogy finally clicked for me. So ACT is like the glue that holds everything together and makes sure our tests actually reflect what's happening in the browser.
Yep, exactly.
You got it.
All right, so we've got a pretty good handle on testing components. We've dipped our toes into hook testing.
We even got a taste of integration testing and mocking. Is there anything else we should cover before we wrap up this whole deep dive into React testing?
Yeah, there's one more thing that comes up a lot that we should probably touch on.
Okay, what's that?
Snapshot testing.
Oh, yeah, snapshot testing. I know that's a bit of a controversial one.
It is. It can be a really useful tool, but it's also one of those things that can be easily misused.
Mm-hmm.
The basic idea that you capture the rendered output of your component and then compare it to a stored snapshot.
Okay.
So if the output changes, the test fails, and that alerts you to any potential unintended side effects.
So it's kind of like a safety net to catch those regressions, especially when you're refactoring or making big changes.
Exactly. It can be really helpful for larger components or components with complex rendering logic.
Right.
But here's the catch. Those snapshot tests, they can be super sensitive to even tiny, insignificant changes.
Yeah, I've definitely run into that before. Change one little space or add a new CSS class, and suddenly your snapshot test is freaking out.
Yeah, and that's where the controversy comes in. Some developers argue that snapshot tests create a lot of noise,
Right?
and that they actually make it harder to maintain your test suite.
Yeah, I can see that.
You end up spending more time updating snapshots than actually testing the important stuff.
So it's like a trade-off. You have the potential to catch regressions early,
Right.
but you might also be creating a lot of extra work for yourself
Exactly.
and maybe even making your tests a little bit more fragile.
Yeah, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
My advice would be to use snapshot testing, but use it carefully.
Okay.
It can be great for catching those unexpected changes in the rendered output,
Mm-hmm.
but don't rely on it as your primary testing strategy.
Okay.
Focus on testing the actual behavior, the functionality of your components.
Right.
Using those techniques that we talked about earlier, querying by role and text, simulating those user interactions and making those specific assertions about the state and the side effects.
That's really good advice. I think I'm finally starting to get a feel for when snapshot testing is appropriate and when it's better to stick with those more focused assertions.
That's great to hear.
Now, before we wrap up this episode, is there any other wisdom you'd like to impart on our listener who is, maybe just starting out on their React testing journey?
We've talked about all the tools and the techniques,
Right.
but I think the most important thing is to approach testing with the right mindset. Don't think of it as a chore or something you have to tack on at the end.
Right.
Embrace it as a core part of the development process.
It's about building quality software from the beginning, not just, trying to patch things up after the fact.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
When you write tests, you're not just verifying that your code works.
Mm-hmm.
You're also documenting its behavior and making it easier to maintain and refactor in the future.
Great.
Plus, it just gives you that confidence, that peace of mind, knowing that your code is solid and reliable.
Yeah, I used to be one of those people who was really resistant to testing. It felt like extra work, and I often skipped it to try to save time.
I get it.
But now, I really see how valuable it is.
Yeah, it's a game changer.
It really is.
And remember, testing is a skill that you develop over time.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and learn from them.
Right.
There's a huge community out there ready to support you.
Yeah,
And the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
that's awesome. Well, this has been such a great deep dive into React testing.
Yeah, it has.
We started with the high-level philosophy,
Yeah.
then we went into all the nitty-gritty details of querying and mocking, and even snapshot testing.
And we talked about some of the common pitfalls along the way.
Exactly.
Right.
And to our listener, I really hope you found this deep dive as valuable as I have. Remember, this is just the beginning.
Yeah, keep learning.
We've given you a solid foundation, but the real learning comes when you start applying these concepts to your own project.
Exactly. So go out there, write some tests, break some things.
Have fun.
Have fun.
Yeah.
And happy testing.
Happy testing.